Hi guys. Hello everyone. We're just waiting for Kathryn Wagner to join, and I will dial her in. Let's see if she's here. Yeah, there she is. Get a connection. Hello.
Good morning, Shoair.
Hi, Kathryn. How are you?
I'm all right, given the circumstances.
Yes.
Given the circumstances.
Yes, and you can hear me okay?
I can. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can. Fantastic. Great. So let's start. I will do a kind of short intro to you first, Kathryn, and say hello to everyone. So thank you everyone for tuning in to PhotoWorks Instagram Live with Kathryn Wagner. PhotoWorks has been doing these live Instagram talks once a week, every Wednesday, for the past few weeks. Obviously, we're all in lockdown and due to the coronavirus crisis, and we're all kind of staying at home doing our bit. Hoping that everyone is keeping safe and well. But during this time, we also wanted to keep connected with artists and keep connected with you guys all across the world. So we've had this series of artist talks and really focusing on artist books. So people that have released books recently or kind of really expansive book projects. And so this week I invited Kathryn Wagner, who is based in San Francisco and has been making work for over 40 years, so has this expansive practice. And I really wanted to speak with Kathryn about her work because in 2018, we actually, I spent quite a lot of time at Kathryn's studio in San Francisco, and I wrote an essay for, which was published in this book. This kind of anthology of Kathryn's work, Place History in the Archive. So we're going to speak about that tonight. And thank you so much for joining us, Kathryn.
Of course.
So I thought we would start by kind of talking about the way in which this book came about. Obviously, you have been making work since the 1970s. When we kind of discussed about this book project and we started talking about it, where was the starting point for you? Was it really was the idea to do kind of like a retrospective of your practice and to compile everything in one place? And I guess I'm interested in this now because so many artists are at home or in their studio at the moment, and they're really kind of looking back at their previous bodies of work now. So I thought, I wondered kind of where your starting point was and whether you were really looking back and wanting to make this big overview.
Well, that's interesting that you say that because a lot of people have contacted me and saying, how do you start looking at 30 years of work? How do you start? And for me, actually, I think it was in 2016, I was invited by Stephen Shoair to do a visiting artist at Bard College in New York. And Stephen commented in his introduction to me that evening, he put all my books on the table and he said something like, but we don't have any recent publications of Kathryn's. And then after the talk, he said to me, hey, why haven't you been doing publications? Because you've been doing all these works. I keep seeing these various bodies of works from shows. And that got me thinking, like, I've been working on so many projects and kind of moving from project to project that I hadn't really stopped to kind of like think about the totality of how this work works together, all these different bodies. So I started thinking of that, and with his encouragement, I said, I think I'm going to put together a book prototype, which is not a retrospective, but a survey, kind of touching on that 30 plus years worth of work. And he encouraged me, and he then wrote in the beginning of the book, he wrote the conversation between he and I about how I think about photographs, how I think about installations in three-dimensional space. So that was one thing. And then another thing was a little farther back than that, maybe it was 2015 or something, Gallery Luisati did an exhibition called Early California Landscapes. And she included the Moscone work and the early California landscapes. And there was quite a bit of interest in that work from curators. I'm thinking specifically of Jock Reynolds, who was at the Yale Art Museum then, the Yale Art Gallery. And they started acquiring early work of mine from work I did from when I was in my early 20s. And I started thinking about the fact that many bodies of work I've done seem to continue to circle around, that there's these linkages and lineages that may come up 10, 15, 20 years later, but that I'm still hashing out ideas that kind of were presented to me early on. And that's what set the tone for thinking about the book thematically, as opposed to thinking about the book chronologically. Because I thought, isn't it kind of interesting to look at an artist's work and see that they've revisited similar kinds of ideas, albeit changes formally and thematically, but that there's some kind of underlying visceral ideas that seem to kind of weave throughout that long trajectory. So that's kind of the origins of the book. And I was working on a project at the Museum of Modern Art Bologna on the Morandi project, and met the owners of Daimiani, who publish all of Hiroshi Sugimoto's books. And I was really impressed with like the craft and the care that they take in making those books. And so it all kind of dovetailed into place, that and they were very interested in doing kind of a survey book. So that's the origins of it.
Yeah. And so the book includes work made from, and I hope I get this right, between 1974 and 2017.
I think it is. I think it's in that time frame. Yeah.
Yeah. And like you were saying, it's now grouped thematically. So there's these 6 themes: archaeology in reversed, investigating place, reclassifying history, near abstraction, art and science, investigating matter, and reconsidering the archive. And then within those 6 themes, there's like 3 books, between 3 and 5 bodies of work. And I guess when I was thinking about, I always think of books in relations to exhibitions, actually. And it's really interesting when you take away chronology from someone's practice, and you really think about form, and you think about ideas, and you think about how those things can evolve over kind of an entire career. So I like this approach that you really went, you left chronology to one side in many ways.
I think there's something about when you're doing a book that has so many bodies of work through time, that there's an expectedness to like the chronology. It's like, and then I did this, and then I did that. But I found it more conceptually interesting to kind of unravel the basket weave and really kind of pinpoint topics and objects and ideas that continue to present themselves in similar but different ways.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to start to show some images from the book. Once we've had a look at your work, I'd like to come back to the question of advice for artists that are looking through their archive now, because I think it's a really actually interesting time, I guess, when you do have time on your hands to look back at your archive, because that's actually really another interesting point, is that often when you're making work and you move from one project to another and one exhibition to another, often you don't have time to really look back and consider things in a really kind of detailed and specific way. And I guess
I think people are by virtue of where we're at right now, people have time to really kind of dig in and be thinking about those things.
Yeah, exactly, which I think is a really positive thing. I'm going to flick through the book and show people some really early work, so the early Californian landscapes, and then I chose two bodies of work that I wanted you to talk about that are two of my kind of personal favorites, and then we're going to speak about something that you chose as well. But let me flip my camera around. There we go. So this is place history in the archive. And like you mentioned, Stephen Shaw wrote in the beginning, which I was super happy to be included in the same book as your work and writing by Stephen Shaw. So that was super exciting for me as a young curator. And just to give people a really kind of general introduction. So this is one of Kathryn's most like earliest bodies of work from the mid 1970s. And you can see really this kind of where your practice was rooted in the West Coast North American new topographics that was happening at that time. So really kind of incredible black and white work that really thinks about like space and form and landscape and environment. And that's something that really runs through your entire practice, is this connection with landscape and the environment. But the first body of work that I wanted you to talk a little bit about, and it's linked to, it's kind of, for me, linked to where we are at the moment. So I chose American Classroom, which is a body of work from 1983 to 1987. And I chose this, I guess, because I was really interested in thinking about the interior space at the moment and thinking about how you made this shift in the 70s from landscape and kind of really photographing outdoors in the landscape to photographing inside spaces and interior spaces, and how this was really connected to also these kind of institutions. So things like the American education system and those kind of really broad institutions that govern society. So I thought that was kind of two things that are relevant to talk about now. Did you want to tell us about this project, American Classroom, and kind of, yeah, give us your insight into it?
Sure. That was the first project I did where I moved the camera inside and started thinking about these kind of quotidian institutional spaces that occupy all our lives at some point, whether it be a schoolhouse or a courthouse or it did, the hierarchy of what it was really didn't matter as much as the way I kind of picked it apart. And what I mean by that is I was fascinated with the notion that the classroom was this kind of repository of ideas, all the marks that are left on the board, all the ways in which the furniture is arranged, the kind of the detritus that the students leave behind, those all become these very pointed signifiers about who we are as a culture. And so I started thinking about how I would get access, and I had written a Guggenheim Fellowship and received a Guggenheim Fellowship to pursue this project, American Classroom. And I was fresh off the National Endowment of the Arts Individual Artist Fellowship, which was going to take me on a little bit of a tour doing lectures at various museums in the United States. So I asked my host, the curator of whatever museum I was going to, could they please send me what was then called the Yellow Pages. A lot of people may not know what that is, but it's the phone book which had all the different kind of indexes of whatever encyclopedic thing you were looking at. And I was looking at schools. So my research really was to call the administration of these various schools, and it could be military academies, primary schools, medical schools, vocational schools, police academies, law schools. It didn't really matter what level it was, because I saw each one of these as being kind of another fragment or another slice of what were these classrooms telling us about who we are as a culture. And in many ways, I see these classrooms as being portraits without faces. They're portraits of the times in which we live, and they're talking about our collective aspirations of who we are as a culture. And in looking back at it now, I see there was an inordinate amount of science classrooms there, which actually ended up becoming a content that I was researching for many years after I finished this project. So I was really thinking about all the various building blocks that go into constructing culture. And my methodology was to go in the classroom as soon as the students were on a break or a lunch break, but not that they had packed up for the day, because I so wanted to have the presence, or the students' presence, of what it was they were studying, the marks on the board. I wanted that kind of peopled presence to be in those photographs. And so in many ways, I see them as portraits of a kind of a collective conscience of culture in terms of our aspirational endeavors. And I was thinking about, you know, much after the fact, I was thinking that so many of my projects kind of used the notion of the transfer of knowledge as a kind of a foundation to build work on. And I think how interesting that, you know, I started with the landscape and moved then into the classroom, which is like the obvious in terms of like the notion of the transfer of knowledge. But there are so many ways in which I think that idea of how knowledge gets transferred, how does culture build off the transfer of knowledge? That seems to be a kind of recurring idea that I continue to circle back to.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. And it goes through a lot of the bodies of work, actually. And it's interesting you pick up this this element of science as well, because it's true that a lot of this early work has this kind of overarching presence of science and the physicality of science and how it was at that period of time as well, compared to, I think, what some of the classrooms would look like today. I also just wanted to touch on, you know, you talked about shifting from the outside landscape indoors, yet your kind of mode of photography was very similar, right? It's like this straight frontal photography that was similar to what you were doing outside, and you brought that technique indoors.
Yeah, I mean, I always try to in all my work, I try to get out of the way. It's like, how much can I get out of the way? And that's not to say that I'm not completely in it in terms of like material wise, conceptually, viscerally. I'm very much in it, but I want to remove that heavy hand, and I want that information that appears in the photograph to be this, you know, this kind of hyper real. And I use the word hyper real because the camera has the ability to, the lens has the ability to see beyond the way that we see. And so many of the photographs that I've made for the last 40 years, there is something both very formal, abstract, and hyper real about them. And that seems to be a kind of maybe a formal signature that has continued throughout my career. So I'm photographing. There's never any kind of like what I would call trickery in the work. I'm trying to get out of the way to let that information describe itself in such a way that the abstraction of it becomes kind of palpable.
Yes. Yeah. And I think like we see that just in this series that we have seen here, you started with the camera quite far away, and we saw these open views, and then now we see these really kind of close-up images of the detail of what was going on. This is one of my favorites.
I'm looking far away. That's the frogs, right?
Frogs, exactly.
And so that one plays a lot on like history in many ways. It's like when you really look closely at that image, there's these wonderful, like, they're called mapping lines, and it's what were used in kind of when Man Ray was doing those rayograms, right? Those the solarization around those frogs came from the sunlight hitting the formaldehyde, and it created this amazing kind of electrifying line that kind of graphically circumnavigates each one of those frogs. But more than that, I think that's a really emblematic image, because I think in so much of my work, there's this kind of, this collision between like horror and beauty. And I mean, for me, I'm always seeing them as quite beautiful, but I'm also recognizing that, you know, it is very much about that tension of horror and beauty, from what side you stand to look at it.
Yeah, that's a really important observation, actually, for sure. And then in the book, we move immediately on to this body of work called Home and Other Stories, which seems very, very on topic right now. And I remember when we were together in your studio, not only is the project really fascinating, but also the life of the project, the life of the photographs after was really fascinating. So we can talk a little bit about that. You know, it was exhibited in 3 different ways, or 2 or 3 different ways, in really quick succession. And I find that's something that's quite fascinating about your work as well, is it's these conceptual projects that exist as images, but then when they move into the installation space, it often becomes something quite different each time it's exhibited. But first, do you want to give us a little bit of an intro into this project?
So that was kind of a maverick project for me. My partner, Loretta Gargan, and myself, we were looking for a home to buy in the early 80s in San Francisco, when one could still buy a home. And I thought that process of kind of going in to see a home during one of these open houses was just kind of one of the most macabre things I'd ever experienced, that you're in this very private domain and you're being confronted with all sorts of kind of representations of like family, domesticity, isolation, privacy, refuge, and all the ways in which people put their homes together. Those representations became incredibly visceral. And I thought to myself, oh, this just seems like such a cinematic project to work on. So I started out using the video and then switched back to the still camera and tried to make what I call sentence-like structures, or sentence-like narratives. And it was like, how few images could I use to form a sentence? So three images formed a triptych. And so that became kind of like a formal structure of how I would pursue that body of work. And I would ask people who I didn't really know. So if I was traveling, I might ask the security guard at the museum, or I might ask my neighbor's neighbor's neighbor, somebody I didn't know, so that the notion of me being able to go in and photograph at this home, I didn't come with any preconceived ideas of who these people were or who the person was. And I could allow the storyteller in me to kind of construct my own narrative. So I photographed for several hours in each home, and, you know, very much in the style that I was working, like 19th century camera, black cloth over the head, 4x5, to be able to make those highly hyper-real, formal-looking photographs. And then it would be later in the studio that I would look at the all the material and begin to do like what I call the storytelling part of it. And so there's nothing documentary about these things, these photographs or homes. They're really my interpretation of other people's lives. And so the one that you're showing now, when I first walked in that home, the only thing I was told was that, oh, it's a psychiatrist and his wife who lived there. And so I looked at that middle photograph and there was 12 portraits. And I thought, oh my God, they have 12 children. And then on further inspection, I realized, no, they have 4 children, and they have this kind of very tender and beautiful homage to their 4 children in time, the chronology as they're growing up. So I kind of played a lot of like kind of games with the way I would put these sentences together. So that would be the middle frame. And then the third frame would be the wallpaper, you know, a complete abstraction, but it formally mirrored the middle frame. So all of these triptychs are put together with completely unscientific methodologies according to like my sense of being a storyteller. And it was a really, it was a powerful body of work for me to do, because I had never, like, I felt like I was in so many people's lives. The part that you talk about in terms of installation. It first opened at LACMA in Los Angeles, and there I worked with making sure that the galleries, I painted the galleries various colors of kind of this green and chromatically gradients from light to dark. And then we made these lights, these frames for the lights, so that when you walked in the gallery, the only thing that you could see were the triptychs, and they looked like televisions when you walked in the gallery. And the opening night, I heard people say that kind of like darkness of the gallery with the illumination of the triptych themselves. I heard people say, "Oh, I'm sure the person who lives here is a flight attendant, and she's never home, and therefore she has only these things in her refrigerator." And it was like, it brought out the storyteller in everybody. And I think it was as far away from the truth as possible of what actually occurred there. But it was interesting how people became very, very involved in kind of like trying to narrate what their projection was of that, of those people's homes. And another installation I did was at another museum, and there I decided I would use color. They were black and white photographs, but I would use color. And we interviewed the gentleman's job, whose job it was to name colors for the Benjamin Moore Paint Company. And it turned out he had that job for like 23 years. And that was his job, was to like look at colors. And if you've ever spent time in a paint shop or a hardware store, I find myself kind of really fascinated with like, how do these colors get named just on a kind of language level? Like, why is this called Devil's Breath? Or why is this called Robin's Wisp? And so I was very interested in this idea of like how the naming of these colors came. So I painted the museum, the 26 new spring colors of that year. And I see you have that up there. Yeah. And so I allowed those triptychs to kind of bifurcate all those colors, and I kind of reversed the strategy of how we look at art. I made the photographs much more diminutive, and then I used the text. Annie Lamont was one of the writers, and she writes a lot about family, and I blew those up to very kind of architectural scale. So you had to move back to read the text in the museum, and then you had to move forward to read the intimacy of the photograph. And then I allowed that kind of like those 26 different colors to kind of animate the space. So installation is an equal part of my practice as the actual making of the photographs.
Yeah. And this, I guess, what really fascinated me about this installation is that because you were using the colors, the interior decorating colors of that season, it's like really a reflection of what was going on at that moment in kind of suburban domesticity in a way, right? It was a really kind of snapshot of that era, which actually doesn't look that out of fashion now, to be honest.
No, you know, it's interesting. People have seen that in that book, and they were like, "Oh, this show looks so fresh. When was this done?" I was like, "Well, it's done 20 years ago or 25 years ago." So.
Yeah, it's really great. And then the final body of work we were going to talk about was one that you selected.
Yeah, you know, Shoair, you asked me to pick something, and I thought, well, maybe we'll talk about the cover image of the book, which is Place, History in the Archive. And I chose that, I chose the body work Reclassifying History, because it seems that in the last 20 years, I continue to cycle back to looking at the way that history's been told, and using information and iconography from a certain period of time and making new narratives and new hybrid narratives that kind of defy or challenge the way that history's been told. And so I'm thinking about the show I did for the DeYoung Museum, the opening of the DeYoung Museum. They commissioned me to do the opening show when the new museum was going to be opening in Golden Gate Park. And I simply had to choose from a period of time in the collection, and I chose American Decorative Arts. And I found these sculptures. There was no museum at the time because it was completely under construction. but everything was in storage. And so I was in a kind of climate controlled storage, and I started kind of unveiling all this Tyvek to look at these various sculptures that were still in their shipping crates. And I used the shipping crates, and like the image here that you see on the cover of the book, I used the shipping crates as a formal device to further talk about this notion of reframing. Because in many ways, what I was doing was reframing the way that history was told. So on one image, you see Christopher Columbus depicted as a young boy. And then next to Christopher Columbus, you see Penelope from the Odyssey. And then next to Penelope, you see Delilah from the Bible in her reframing craze. And Penelope is kind of strapped down on this pallet. Well, there's no reason why Christopher Columbus, Penelope, and Delilah would ever be together in history. So by creating these fictive histories, I'm asking people to rethink the way that history's been told to them. And I've done so much work where I'm kind of looking in archives, whether they be Braille books or I did a project called The Narrative History of a Light Bulb. I'm looking at archives all the time, and I'm thinking about how I can recontextualize the ways in which those items or those objects were collected. I'm trying to kind of give a new meaning and a new understanding, not just to history, but to the actual objects of that collection. So, you know, the archive has been a really important part of my work. And when I think back all the way to Moscone, you know, I was photographing what I call archaeology in reverse. I was photographing future ruins, the notion of the future. And if you think about archaeology, archaeologists are excavating to look at the past. And I feel my work is always kind of excavating to look at the times in which we live and to look at the future.
Yeah, that is like a really kind of succinct overview, actually, summary of your practice. And I think what fascinates me most about this project is that you're really the audience of the museum audience rarely or never gets to see the collection in this state. Mm-hmm. It never gets to see it in a state of storage, and it never gets to see it in a state where it's not very very precisely curated.
Right.
And this kind of reveals that actually how formulaic that is, and how much of a perspective the museum is able to create through how they show their collection. So it's a really nice commentary on that, actually. And can I ask, when they opened the museum, were these photographs shown alongside the objects in the collection?
No, the objects were in different areas of the collection. We specifically wanted to keep them separate because they became their own being. The photographs really became their own being. And the chairs, for instance, those were all laid out chronologically in terms of the history of the chair. But if the one that you're looking at now, it's these two Ames chairs, you know, a dark one and a lighter maple one. And they're in this confrontation. And it was quite something. There were so many classes that came, school classes that came, and they would hold these seminars in front of that photograph, and everybody had to write about race. And I thought that was so interesting, the ways in which these new configurations kind of brought out completely different conversations than the chronology of kind of laying out the history of the chair.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, I'm going to flip the camera back around now. Let's get this. Okay, fantastic. And thank you so much for walking us through the book. If anyone has any questions, then type them in the comments box below and we can attempt to answer those. But while we're doing that, Kathryn, I just wanted to ask you, do you have any advice, going back to that kind of original question, do you have any advice for photographers that are looking back at their archives now? Yeah, in terms of kind of like anything you learned from the process.
I think it's if you can, you know, if you're sequestered in your home, you know, get onto that long dining room table and kind of start laying out, whether they're in analog form or in print form, start kind of laying out a lot of work and start kind of playing with different projects next to each other, so that it helps you begin to think of the work not just in the confines of that body of work that you made, but in a larger trajectory. And you can't help but, you know, I always think I'm informed by the times in which I'm living. Well, right now I'm informed by the times of this pandemic. It's like there's something very, you know, we're in this container. And so I think whatever is going on in the world informs the way we look at our work. And I want to be cautious to people, because I've heard a lot of young artists say, oh, I feel that my work is no longer relevant. You know, here we have this pandemic. You know, I don't know what I'm doing. And I want to be cautious to younger artists. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, because the work you were doing before the pandemic still has a life of its own. You know, throughout history, there have been epidemics, and those epidemics have happened. And you can't just erase the ideas that you were working on and say they no longer have value, because we are in this present moment, which is as powerful as can be. So to spend time with that work and kind of like, you know, allow the criticality of the editorial process, open that up so that you're just in the process of looking right now and maybe being reinformed yourself. I mean, how many times do you ever read a book and you reread it years later and you're a different person? And the way that poetry or that language communicates with you has a completely different meaning than when you read it the first time. I find that happens with artwork, and that when I revisit a work that I haven't seen for many years, I think that's so interesting that there's a whole other kind of like, you know, layering of entering that is now informed by the fact that I'm different, or the times we're living in.
Yeah, the context shifts as time and history shifts, which we kind of we often forget that until it's upon us. I'm just going to read this question. Are you working on any new projects now, and how do you reflect, and how do these reflect the previous work?
Well, I'm deep into a project of doing these wall drawings that initially started out as my interest in architecture. I mean, I didn't talk about that, but architecture has very much been a framework for a lot of the way I think, whether it's construction or the architecture of space or the conceptual notion of the idea of building. And I had to move out of my studio that I'd been in for over 21 years. And I started making these very intuitive drawings out of blue painter's tape. And I started just responding to the geometries of the architecture that I was in, and just intuitively making new geometries. So in other words, drawing with tape. And then returned back to that idea of language, like the color paint language. My studio was a block away from a major paint store. And I started selecting colors based on the language, on like what the language was saying. So like meteor dust, or these different titles. And then that was first. And then I started rolling the paint in to these new geometries. And then I made the photograph. So it's really a hybrid experience of drawing, painting, and then the photograph. And the photograph gets made because it flattens space. And I can't bring everybody to that architectural site in situ. And so the photograph becomes the vehicle for people to now experience that photograph, painting, drawing. And I've been working on that for the last 3 years in conjunction with a set of still lifes of these wooden block architectural models that I'm creating kind of new hybrid spaces for. So very much kind of returning to this idea of architecture and drawing.
Yeah. That's super fascinating, actually, because you just reminded me that when I was visiting you in 2018, you were kind of going through your studio and packing things up in anticipation
Of the move.
Of the move, yeah. And it felt like it was all kind of being tied together, making the book, the kind of studio that you'd had for so long, that space coming to an end. So it's really exciting for me to hear about what you're working on next. And I think we'll end it there. Thank you so much for speaking with me tonight. And I guess this book has so much more in it that we didn't get the chance to talk about tonight. So it's available
on Amazon.com.
Where
available on Amazon.com.
Yes, order the book. It is it's an incredible kind of look at your work. And
thank you, Shoair. Thank you so much for initiating this. It's just we don't get to see each other so much, and normally we see each other at Perry Photo. I don't even know if there will be a Perry Photo this year, given the given what's happening with the travel bans and all.
Exactly. Exactly, and I guess that's the nice thing to come out of this situation for me has been actually having the initiative to connect with people like you on the other side of the world, and being able to have this type of communication and conversation. So it's been really amazing, and I look forward to seeing you in person soon, I hope.
Me too, you. So thank you.
Everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.
All right, thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.